Welcome to the Wealth Tech Insider. This is a podcast about wealth and technology, what's changing, what's getting overcomplicated, and what actually matters once the noise dies down. We talk about real decisions in wealth tech, the tools, the trade-offs, and the human side of trying to make change stick. If you're curious about where this space is heading, you're in the right place. Let's get into it. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Wealth Tech Insider. I'm your host, Danni, Grande, and I'm happy to be joined by my co-host, Peter Warne. Hey, Pete, how's it going?
Hey, good day. How are you?
Good, thank you. We're going to run through another one of your code and capitals. You're just really churning out the content here for us to use in our podcast. So let's go through your last one.
There's just so many. There's just so many things to write about, Danny, and there's so many low hanging targets we can have a look at. But I did actually have a break from the AI shtick this week. As you can see, and I'm going to have a couple of breaks from AI because it's fun to write about, but I get tired of it.
Yeah, it's done to death. Hey, it's so interesting. We have to be talking about it, but yeah, let's talk about something else. Like your latest code and capital. Well, actually, I was thinking about what we're going to title this episode, and you put it in your CNC: how to design the worst industry on Earth. So I take it you're referring to the one that we actually.
What I said was an ineffective advice industry. You're taking a poetic license here, saying the worst industry on earth. So don't misquote me. Now, if you want to put the title out of the podcast, we'll get lots of those clicks. Go for it.
Yeah, do a bit of clickbait.
But I think ineffective was where I landed. But if you want to call that terrible or worst or whatever, then go for it.
Yeah, no, I love it. I think obviously I love it because it's so true the way that you wrote about this. And I think you started this by saying that somebody asked you, or maybe you were doing a prezzo and somebody asked what was our industry like, and what answer did you give them?
It was just so hard. So our software developers do a lot of work in the defense industry as well as financial services. So I was actually talking to someone in the defense industry who was ex-military, and he said to me, "Gee, I've always been fascinated by the superannuation financial advice industry. Could you just talk me through it?" Because he was actually explaining to me how the defense industry works, which was a whole different thing and quite fascinating, I have to say. And to an outsider, it's really hard to explain why things are the way they are, either without getting political or negative or overcomplicating it. And so I guess on one hand, you could sort of simply say like what our core purpose as an industry is, which is obviously to create a prosperous future for all Australians where they're financially independent. Like that's a nice little one that I like to look at, and that's sort of the core purpose of the industry. But boy, how we've gone about it, you couldn't make this stuff up. It's the complexity. So that was the spirit of the article.
And I guess the complexity is, and I hear you when I'm trying to explain. I was actually talking to my husband about it the other day. He's a tradie, and I was trying just to explain how the licensee model and how that works. And then I ended up like drawing pictures and trying to explain how he's a smart guy, but even just that on its own is somewhat complex to explain. But I guess and you pointed this out, nobody really agrees in our industry who the actual customer is. So we've got the licensee, we've got the platform, we've got the product manufacturers, we've got the advisors, and each one thinks they're the main character in their clients' lives, and the client sort of gets the leftovers there. And maybe this is the misalignment and why why things fragment across the industry. Everybody's kind of optimizing for a different boss and that sort of thing. I think we deeply understand that in the work that we do with technology. The systems we work with, they were sort of never really built to talk, and maybe never really thinking about the end consumer in mind.
Totally. I mean, I think people often critical some of the major tech players that have been sort of stalwarts of the industry, but everyone forgets that a decade ago, those tech players had half their revenue coming from bank-owned wealth management operations that had bank-type requirements. And now the IFA market's confused that they don't value a lot of the stuff that's put in place for the bank. So this is sort of one of those issues, right? Where we're always going to have where when the customer changes quite quickly, an industry is really going to struggle to adapt to that. And I guess the other aspect that we have is just these layers of complexity that often mean when we have issues like the Shield Guardian collapse, we actually spend 6 or 12 months fighting over who's responsible. Where in other industries, it's often abundantly clear. who's responsible for the mistake. And I think I don't want to wade into that necessarily. I think that's been covered enough, but I think that's a perfect example of why these layers of complexity is not optimal from a consumer perspective. And I guess the spirit of the article really was to, and I think I've done a few of these before, where this inversion trick. So rather than sort of writing a paper to say how things should be, why don't you write a paper to say, well, or what your goal is? Write a paper which basically says, if I do all these things, I'm guaranteed to fail. These are the things that will make me fail. It's often it's a counterintuitive way to business plan, but I think it's underrated. And so Charlie Munger, world famous investor and contrarian, had this trick. It was called inversion. So basically, and his simple line was always, I don't want to, I know I don't want to die, so I'll just make sure I don't go where that's likely to happen. And so I think, and I'm not certainly saying our industry is dying, it's far from that, but I think what is really good to sort of say, well, if we were going to set ourselves up for failure, what are the things we would do and think about as an industry to set ourselves up for failure? And this article obviously steps through 6 rules that would guarantee that.
Yeah. So rule 1, nobody agrees with the customer, is rule 2, ticket clippers and fee stacking. This is probably key, right? So we've got the advice fee.
Yep.
We've got the platform charging fees. We've got investment management fees. We've got managed account fees on top of that. If you're part of a licensee, you're taking a clip as the licensee. So, if it's a value chain that I think you said here the toll road transurban would admire. Every fee defensible alone is stacked. It's a gauntlet, and a client's dollar runs before it's even invested. It's so true if you really look down at the micro of how that all works.
Yeah, and I think my point was that each one in isolation easy to justify. Everyone earns their clip, so to speak. But when you have so many in a sequence, you can see quite easily how, and it's not so much about the quantum. Like I think fees have dropped and various things, and I think we're a lot sharper than fees, even product fees, than we were 15, 20 years ago when you and I started the industry, that the fees were outrageous. But I think the problem with it all is that it's the complexity. It's not so much the overall amount. It's just the number of the amount of tickets that have to be clipped and how many times they're clipped. And every time it's clipped, there's a level of inefficiency built into that. That's all not optimal, not optimized for the customer. So I think that was the point of that thing, to say, well, are we actually, and we've just found ways to, the minute we look like we're simplifying as an industry, a new way to clip the tickets developed.
100%, 100%. But it's created incredibly siloed ways of doing things, right? I think if we look at all of these things in isolation, platforms do their job pretty well. Technology does its job pretty well. People get pitchforked at that because I know a lot of people aren't happy with their CRMs, but typically end-to-end advice CRMs do the job that they were designed to do, right? But it's just, we've created all of these unique, special, individualized ways of doing things, which leads to all these other problems. And we know from our technology health check data that, just things like SOA production, the number one bottleneck, it currently sits at 11.3 hours on average. And the only thing that moves that number down in terms of hours to do your SOA is the number of platforms that you're using. So, that reduces complexity and all those sorts of things.
Yeah, I think, and as I said, I think because everyone's trying to justify their own existence and survival, we become quite entrenched. And what it means is the people who are adjacent to those providers will have to adapt to the provider's model to cater to their world. And our colleague Aaron always has this catch cry. We had a business planning session yesterday, and he sort of said one of our golden tenets has to be for Nura is that we're not in the business of solving other people's business model problems. So in other words, we will help people solve their business problems, but we cannot change our North Star, our way of doing things just because someone else's business model problem requires that we do that. That's not a good way to operate. So I think, and I think what has happened is certain commercial practices that have just accumulated over a long period of time, frankly, have just forced everybody to accept some constraints, I suppose, that are not ideal. And so I think one of the great constraints in our model is that we've so under self-interest with technology, obviously, but we have so always seen technology as such an afterthought in all those little value chains along the line, that it's become the whatever's left over gets spent on tech effectively, and yet somehow we're all really shocked that no one's happy with their tech. So that was simply the point in that rule, and I think what I'd like to see in the next decade, and I think we can play a role in this, is there ways that we can simplify those value chains that are good for the overall industry, not just for, and they may well be bad for one or two players in those spaces, but this has happened in every other industry. Look at the taxi industry. How bad was the taxi industry 20 years ago? It was so hard to get a taxi license. Cab charge would charge you 10% to use a credit card. Like it was
Cab charges, the
remember cab
vouchers.
charge? Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Oh, geez, we're really showing our age now.
it did require Uber to come along, right?
Yeah.
You'd ring a cab charge, and then a taxi, and they radio a cab, and you didn't know whether they'd show up, and all these sort of things, right? It required a technology disruptor to actually completely simplify that value chain entirely. Now, whether that was good or bad, everyone's going to have a different perspective, but I would say that most people would agree, at least from a consumer perspective, that Uber's been a net positive for the world from an economy perspective on that side. But it was pretty bad for the people who own taxi licenses, as an example. So I think this is the risk. This is the risk that someone actually comes in with really disruptive business models, and it's usually technology orientated to break these value chains apart.
And may I say, or challenge, or ask the question: how many advice firms are actually, again, thinking about the consumer at the end of all of this? What does the client? Have we asked our clients what they actually want as part of this process, or are we really overcomplicating things in the back and middle offices where we can simplify what's really important to the clients? I don't know. I find with probably most of our clients, they haven't ever really surveyed their clients, their advice clients. So yeah, I think that is something to think about as well. All right. So rule 3, regulate supply till it collapses. So we've had education standards, PY for our international listeners. That's professional year here for advisors. We've got rise in compliance all at once.
Yeah, we've made it almost impossible to become an advisor. Certainly from an experience pathway, it's challenging. And this is well documented. Advice firms who are ultimately wearing the load of this have to basically self-fund PY candidates. I'm a non-exec director of a advice business that's doing that quite aggressively, but it's cost and time intensive, and does require practitioners to take time out of the field to actually help and coach and mentor those people. But we've completely destroyed the sort of supply of new advisors coming into the market, and everyone would say, well, that was the government. I would put it quite differently. I would actually argue that the complexity of industry structures, our inability to lobby and engage the government correctly and prosecute our case and actually have a business model that was defensible as an industry, has put us in this position. So it's all well and good to blame whoever was in government at that time and all this sort of played out. But I would argue that we put ourselves in this position, and that industry complexity has actually created this environment. So I think that is a huge problem for the sector, because I don't know how we get out of that, to be honest with you, in the short term without changing things significantly. And I think the biggest loss, frankly, is that we've totally missed the mark on letting accountants joining the sector. It's hard for accountants now to become financial advisors. So I don't know. So there was a bit of tongue-in-cheek comment I put in there, but then we run industry events saying the supply gap has never been bigger, and we're all sort of shocked that this is how it ended up. And I think anyone that's been in the industry a long time is in no way surprised that we are where we are. We have to own it, that we've got a lot of things wrong, and we need to put some things in place to build trust and confidence back from our government, our regulator, and the consumer, that we should actually make advice a more attractive industry for people to join.
Yeah, we built a whole conference circuit around it, didn't we? Really?
It's a great first slide. Every slide, doesn't matter who you are, tech, fund manager, compliance, always the first slide is the supply gap. So I think we get it, but the real question is how do we get there, and how do we avoid it happening again?
Yeah. All right, rule 4, make the living pay for the dead. So this is, I guess you're saying, when a firm collapses and harms clients, the bill goes to every advisor still standing, then to whoever has the biggest pot. Nobody sort of really chases the wrongdoer.
Yeah, so I think this is definitely not about the fee for no service and charging dead people. I think we've had those issues come about. No, this is absolutely about advice collapses that have happened. There's quite well-known ones playing out at the moment. There's been lots of historical ones, and the tragedy of it all is that it's actually the existing advisors who are left behind that foot the bill through the compensation scheme of last resort. It's the platform providers that are made to pay in this latest one because they have the biggest pots of money and all the rest of it. And I think what's even just baffling is that those individuals who maybe weren't directly responsible for the poor advice or the poor product structures, but potentially enabled or turned a blind eye to those things happen, are perfectly capable of going and starting over again in the current realm. We have no mechanism as a profession to permanently ban people. It's done by the regulator. So every other industry has the Law Society or the Royal College of Surgeons where they can actually, the profession itself can remove people like that from the sector altogether. And so I feel like we'll constantly be in this cycle unless we have a mechanism to do that once and for all.
Oh, this is heavy.
I had a lot of people respond to this one.
Did you?
Yeah.
Should we pivot and change industries, do you think? Should we
No,
become
look,
builders or something?
no, because I here's the great thing about our industry. And this is the thing that pisses me off so much, frankly, because you're actually doing such a social good. Like there's so many social goods out of what we do as a sector. You know, letting people take control of their finances, letting people become self-funded retirees and not dependent on the government, which, by the way, I don't think we're going to have a choice in the future. That's the way it's got to be, right? And so many people that just those little bits of advice along the way can save them so much heartache and challenges. So, no, this is an awesome industry, but we have just found a way to really make it hard on ourselves.
Complicated.
You know,
Yeah.
overcomplicate it. So I think that's probably what this is getting at.
Yeah. All right. Rule 5, a dozen umpires who don't agree. So we've got, I think, 12 associations for 15,000 advisors, each with a slightly different kind of reform. They want Canberra to pass first, some sponsors funding the same events, covering the same sort of content.
We have so many industry associations. So good on the FPA and FAAA to merge. That's been a real win, I think.
Yeah.
That never made sense to me. But even despite that, that they are really trying to position themselves as the peak body. They haven't really got there yet. And I think we still have these other fringes who I suppose would all claim in their own right that they represent special interests or special niches in the industry. So the Self-Managed Super Fund Association is probably a good example of one where they represent a niche. And that will happen in every profession, I assume. There's different associations for dentists as there are for GPs and those things. But I think fundamentally the job to be done for all these industries is still they're still predominantly made up of financial advisors, all working under the same regulatory regime, all lobbying the same minister is probably my issue. And so I don't know. Do we need that many associations for like what? And I guess why are these created? Like why are we doing this? It's clearly because we are still an industry that can't agree.
Well, yeah, and then we don't have a strong voice there, right? Who's, advocating for a agreed industry-wide thing that people feel they'll benefit from.
Yep. And I think, I'm all for the right to form these associations and, those things that they're certainly good. But for whatever reason, people feel a strong desire, they're drawn to them. But I would say particularly through the DBFO period. So that was that one, we had that little window when QAR was happening, Quality Advice Review, now DBFO, where we had this window as an industry to align and come up with some ways forward, which would help everybody. And yet we still fell into the old trap of sending in 150 different submissions, and some people collaborated, some people didn't. And government just goes, these guys are a rabble. They can't agree on anything. But why would they be in the middle of this? So I do use the analogy of a footy field with 20 coaches on it. It's just impossible. And I think the government loves this, frankly, because it can allow them to effectively do nothing because that's the only way to please everybody or not please everybody at the same time.
Yeah, just keep on the fence about everything. All right, Rule 6, Ferrari software at Datsun prices. All right, let me talk about this one.
This is yours.
So we want world-class bespoke software in a market smaller than, I think you said a Storm crowd, didn't you?
Melbourne Storm NRL crowd, yeah.
Yeah. Expected to get cheaper as this market shrinks. Then we've chucked AI at the problem, and we're just going to, I guess, hope for the best. So I think we've got a total addressable market here of around 7,000 practices, I think, to spread this across. So software it can't get cheaper as the market shrinks. So it's fewer shoulders, it's a heavier load, and it's not malice. I don't think any of the tech companies are deliberately out to get advisors.
No, I don't think anyone starts the day hoping to do a really bad job.
No, so, and we spend less in our global peers. We demand, we're demanding this Ferrari, but we're really refusing to fund it. And I think, and then we act shocked when it isn't perfect. We're doing deals on the side, and I do find this quite messy. Obviously, we work in it every day, so I'm probably going to feel it a little bit more than the average person. But
yeah, no offense to Datsun owners either. I think Datsuns are probably now gone up in value. They're probably a rare.
the old Datto,
Yeah,
yeah.
everyone wants a Datto. But I think the spirit's there, right? That we have. So the addressable market for software is about $220 million in annual licensing. It's shrunk. And look, we are seeing some green shoots. Like we've spoken on this podcast how even in our software business, we probably face less pricing pushback than I potentially expected, which has been pleasing. And so that's good if people see value and they can equate the ROI. And I think obviously the content you put out, Danny, the way we frame our consulting engagements and that ROI mentality, I think starting to cut through a bit. And now obviously with AI, people are looking at, well, okay, yep, we know we need to invest and think of it as a people cost. So things are slowly changing, I suppose. I think the biggest challenge that we'll still have to confront, though, is that it's this desire that people always get drawn back into wanting to just customize the hell out of everything. And so that's probably where we struggle as an industry, because you just can't get people to agree on ways of doing things. So it makes it very hard, even for businesses like in our software business, an advice designer, like we've got a long list of product features we'd love to roll out. But I know that every user is going to have a different perspective on that because of the way they'll do business. So I guess that's probably the biggest challenge. There's one other challenge I just want to frankly face into, which is the commercial one. So there has been a tendency for software companies to lean into quite heavy discounting arrangements to get quick market traction. Now, I think you do that when the market's growing quickly and you've got a lot of competitors, then you probably look at those things where you get real scale benefits for that. So, if we had a group with 500 advisors come to us wanting to use Advice Designer, no problem. They're going to get a deal, right? Because of that, because we can get a lot of users on board because they're going to have hopefully one way of doing business and we can implement that way. But if I'm talking to a licensee or an industry association or someone who says, oh, well, we have 500 advisors that are part of our community or our whatever, online, whatever. Well, those 500 advisors or 250 practices still operate in their own way. We still have to onboard them. We still have to support them. We have to configure and manage them and all the rest of that happens. How is it in anyone's commercial interest to sort of offer this discount for this perceived volume that exists there? Because anyone that runs a SaaS company knows it's not just, selling a license and you bugger off. It's frankly, half of our costs go on service and support and implementation. So I think we just created some really unhealthy practices that I'd love to see go, but I can't control that. All I can control is what we do as a company. And I've made it quite clear that that's our position. It's hurt us probably commercially, I'd say, but I just want the product to do what it does. And at the end of the day, I think every time you offer a discount to users that probably shouldn't get one, you're just selling the other users that pay full price. You're selling them short.
Yeah, and it doesn't, just because you're selling it, cutting a deal, it doesn't mean that person is going to cost you less to service. And in fact, I would probably argue that smaller firms who don't have a lot of resources, 1 and 2 man advice firms, are potentially going to take more time because they may not have other people in the business to help them implement technology and do all of those sorts of things. So they're leaning on the software providers to help them do that. Which that does cost money, as we know.
Yeah. Look, look, honestly, if you've got the margins to give heavy discounts to users, great. Like, good for you. But most of the software companies we know and talk to do not have those margins at the moment because they're just not growing. The scale isn't there. So, and I think the best thing software companies can do for their own ongoing viability and their ability to reinvest in their products and services is to, where possible, hold the line on those things. And the minute a few start holding a line, I think it's better for everybody, frankly.
Yeah. I think be clear on your pricing too, not ambiguous. I think that's the other thing that, sometimes it's not clear cut, is it? How much something is going to cost you. If you ask how much is this going to cost me, it depends on how many advisors you have and how many reports you're going to be producing and how many clients, sometimes pricing gets overly complex, and I think that's quite confusing to the market, and we're probably really calling for simplicity there. So I think we just want to know, right? We just want to know what it's going to cost us. So Where's the hope? What are we doing, Pete?
God.
Give us some pearls of wisdom.
Firstly, I think we know the problems. Like, I think we know what are some solvable gaps in our industry, and so where are the opportunities? So we have we're lucky in our consulting business. We most of the businesses we work with are growing and are profitable and are doing quite well and want to get better. And so I see huge optimism in those businesses and an opportunity for the industry to reshape around those sort of business models, those practices in the future. I think we have to confront some brutal truths. And I think the brutal truths are that there are probably only certain players in our market that can potentially make the requisite investments that people are looking for to improve. And let's just put the tech lens on it, to really make some big investments in tech that are going to benefit the wider industry. So we've spoken at length about the balance sheets that NetWealth and Hub and other major platforms have to sort of start pouring money into tech. And they're the ones that are probably going to do it. And I think that's okay. I still hear stories and increasingly hear feedback from some other industry stakeholders like licensees and some associations who are nervous about that, who feel threatened by platforms entering that space. And my question to them is, well, if the platforms don't, are you going to spend 20 or 30 million in the next 3 years on data infrastructure or whatever the case is? So I think we would be better served as an industry if we all decided to sort of potentially stay in our lanes a little bit now. But even then, no one agrees what their lanes are. So every business I talk to thinks they're in the tech business and all the rest of it. So I think the free market will figure out a lot of these things. I think what I would love to see though, and I think advice businesses are creating some simplicity at the moment, is we just need to find out what are some things we can take away. What are some complexity we can take away out of this industry? And maybe for you as an advice business, maybe your complexity is, well, I'm not going to be a member of 3 or 4 different industry associations because that's just a really bad use of my time. I'm not going to be a member of this, and this, and this because, again, bad use of my time. I just think, and even Finura, like we had a planning day yesterday, a lot of that was about subtraction. It was about removing complexity out of our business. So I think this is a bottom-up thing that will probably change. I think advice businesses that choose the path of simplicity will actually self-select into a more efficient operating model for the industry, and will almost mean that it becomes, self-fulfilling from my perspective on this stuff as well. So I guess I think they're the big ones. I also think that if we don't get the tech stuff right from a regulatory surveillance, monitoring, supervision point of view now, we never will. We have the ability to stop a guardian shield from happening now via tech if our licensees all decide to work together on some infrastructure that will solve for pre-vet, audit, those sort of technology. The data is there to sort of identify when these problems are before they arise. And wouldn't it be wonderful for the industry to actually be in a position where it can actually self-monitor itself and prevent these things happening? So they're probably the two big, opportunities and hope, I suppose, around that. And I do think it's probably a painful process for them, but I do think the firms that are merging and acquiring and getting bigger and bigger are ramming into their practices slowly but surely a more standard way of operating. And I think that will help the software companies too. Yeah, that's my hope. What about you?
Yeah, I agree. I think the firms that win won't have the most tools, and I think they'll have the fewest of those broken handoffs. When we can see again, where things get fragmented across the advice journey, either because of lack of process, lack of utilizing tech, all those sorts of things. So I think addressing all of that is going to be really important. And also, it's interesting what you say. Advice firms seem to obviously they're becoming really tech savvy, but I find sometimes they are crossing the bridge into becoming tech experts. And I think obviously AI has really made us digress from all of those really important regulatory things that you're talking about, the simplification, all of that. We've now got AI, which is obviously fabulous and can do some wonderful things, but it's really distracting, I think, and it's really taken us away from those core problems that we need to solve, all the boring stuff first. So yeah, I think we just need to just take a breather, take a step back, and trust that the tech companies, do know what they're doing. They're full of developers, they're full of experts, they're full of people that have worked in our industry before and are subject matter experts in how advice firms run. A lot of them are. So just have a listen to them, I think is probably, and have a little bit of faith that they're going to be beneficial to your firms.
Yeah, totally. And I think, it's sort of hot off the press, but, and we're keen to see more, but I think some of the major software companies and platforms are going to roll out some pretty nifty AI capabilities in the future that'll mean that those self-developed AI tools in advice firms just aren't necessary anymore.
Yeah.
And even overnight in the UK, like IntelliFlow made some pretty interesting announcements about some agentic capability in their platform and things they're doing. So, I mean, jury's out as to whether that sort of sees itself in Australia, but at the same time, that shows you what can happen when you have 20,000 advisors on a single platform like an IntelliFlow. They can invest, and they now got private equity backing. They can actually really invest in those capabilities. So I think the smart money is that those things are happening, not as fast as the startups. Of course, not. No big organization's ever going to move as fast as the startups. But if you've got 10 or 15 years of data with that business, I would imagine your experience of AI is going to be a lot better in the near term.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, definitely.
Anyway.
Excellent. Thank you. I loved reading that, Coding Capital. Have you got any ideas what your next one is going to be?
Yeah, well, I actually got to write a bit about Microsoft's announcements last week, which was really about building their own frontier models, decoupling from OpenAI, from what I can gather, decoupling from Anthropic. I think they are going all in on their own proprietary AI models, which are fit for purpose, built for teams. And I know we have lots of people who have had a fluctuating relationship with Copilot over the last 18, 24 months. It was clippy not so long ago, and now it's becoming pretty good. And so I think it's well worth paying attention to, because I think the experience you're going to get out of Microsoft in the not too distant future is going to be on parallel, if not better, than what you're getting out of Claude.
Very good. Excellent. Thanks, Pete.
Thanks,
and
Danni.
Thank you for listening, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time. That's it for this episode of the Wealth Tech Insider. If today's conversation got you thinking about your own technology setup, what's working, what's clunky, or what's quietly slowing things down, we've built a technology health check you can find on our website. It's a practical way to understand where you're at with tech and where it makes sense to focus without turning it into a major project straight away. If the episode was useful, feel free to share it or subscribe for future conversations, and thank you for listening.